So welcome to the April Fiscal and Economic Issues Discussion Group of the Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action Crew. Our mission is, which we have all chosen to accept on this call, is to understand the facts, sharpen our arguments, and then communicate to our audiences. So we encourage you to share any and all of these slides on any and all of your social media feeds, talk it over with your friends, email them the presentation, just distribute this information as widely as you care to do so. We're going to talk a little bit about the coronavirus updates. We give you updates on the statistics for the coronavirus. Then we go through the labor market, talk about the unemployment rate and jobs, where we stand on that. Go through the budget deficits and debt, which will include a couple of interesting things that President Biden has done recently. Carl will go through those two sections. And then we'll talk about the economic statistics, the Federal Reserve, inflation. There's some talk in the news about risk of inflation, and we think it's overblown, but we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll go through an interesting topic called sector balances, which has to do with how different parts of the economy balance and influence each other. We talked about that last in detail back in 2019. And so only a few people had their brains explode when we did that. So we'll see if we do better this time. But it's a little more complicated because it involves several kind of interrelated things that we talk about otherwise. But it's kind of fun, too, to once you get your head around it, it's pretty impressive. And then we'll go through Biden's plans, the latest one being the infrastructure plan that he's talking about. We covered the $1.9 trillion rescue plan in the last meeting, but we'll also cover that again in the budget deficits and debt. All right. So coronavirus, looking at the confirmed COVID deaths through April 16, the European Union is a little bit ahead of us, but in terms of one single country, we are the defending champions with 566,000 dead. So about 3 million dead globally, about 300,000 more since March 19th. So in the last month, about 10% more people died, a little less. And then also our next big milestone is the Civil War deaths with an estimated somewhere in that 620 to 750,000 dead soldiers in the Civil War. We passed the World War II soldier casualty count in the low 400,000s. So this is the next largest single event in terms of American fatalities. So the United States, 566,000, Asia, all of Asia, which is much more populated between India and China and others, at 461. And then down the line, you can see the different amounts from different countries and different continents. I have to say I'm very surprised at how well Africa is doing, considering how poor it is, but they are doing much, much better than we are, assuming their counting is accurate, which is a big assumption. But you can see France, Germany, and others. This is not adjusted for population. So
It's also interesting considering that African Americans in this country have supposedly had a higher fatality rate than average, and yet in Africa itself, the country is doing better than we are.
Yeah.
So it's not a racial sensitivity, apparently.
I'm very curious to see how they analyze this when after this we've had some time to put this behind us and see how the different demographic groups have made out in the different countries. But yeah, it's a good observation. I mean, in all of Africa, 117,000, that's the whole continent. And I find that hard to believe, but we'll see if over time how that straightens out. Brazil is definitely really feeling it. They're catching up.
Well, that would include Egypt too, and other places in North Africa.
Yeah.
South Africa as well, obviously. So yeah.
Yep. When you look at when you adjust then per million, so per capita, adjusting for population, we're fourth behind Italy, United Kingdom, and Brazil. About 1,700 deaths per million people, or about 1.7 in every 1,000. My high school class had about 3,000 people. So I tried to put that number in perspective. That would have been about 5 or 6 people that died in a high school. And granted, young kids are doing a lot better, but just thinking about 6 people in my high school dying of COVID when I was there would have been a kind of a scary number from a perspective. When you look at cases now, the number of deaths as of April 16th, 7-day rolling average, the United States has been consistently dropping since that early January surge and is still down. We haven't seen that resurgence in deaths. However, we have in cases. If you look on the right-hand graph, I've just put the EU in there for comparison. The United States has started to climb again in terms of cases. The EU has already climbed and is sort of in this plateau. Now, when you look at kind of this range, if you sort of expanded that last month or so, the last 2 months, we've been in this range of 55,000 to 70,000 for almost 2 months. And one of the epidemiologists I follow on Twitter, his view was the B117 variant is much more contagious than the other one, but also a lot more people have been vaccinated. And he thinks those two forces are battling it out in terms of maintaining this plateau. If you had the old variant and the first one and the vaccinations, you'd be improving. But because he thinks this variant is much more contagious, we're not. And we're sort of battling in this, we're sort of fluctuating in this range. In terms of the vaccination process, this one is per 100 people. So it gives you a rough estimate of percentage, but it's not the same because of the two-dose idea. So we have in the United States administered doses equivalent to 60% of the population if all had received only one dose. However, we've given 2 doses to a lot of people, particularly elderly, so that you can't use that 60% exactly. And Ronald Klain, who is the White House Chief of Staff, tweeted some information about this on 4/18, and he said, you can read it here, but Saturday, 65% of 65-year-olds are fully vaccinated. 50% of all adults have at least one shot. And now the vaccinations sites are open to all ages. So that was just one way of looking at what these numbers mean. But the United States is doing very well. Israel, of course, is the champ. But the UK and the US doing very well. But some other parts of Europe not doing so well. Germany's had a real problem getting the vaccine even. And Germany's done very well when you compare their statistics against others in terms of deaths and cases. They're doing very well. So I'm not exactly sure what the supply issue is with them. Does anybody know? Anybody read up about why?
Well, I think that they were more heavily reliant on AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, and there's been some pauses on those vaccines due to they're looking into the blood clot issue.
Okay.
I read somewhere that there were 13 different vaccines in use around the world. I couldn't hope to name them, though.
Well, I know that's true. I also recall hearing somewhere or reading that at least one of the Chinese versions is not terribly effective. And I can't remember where it was being used. Brazil, maybe? It was problematic, where the Pfizer and the Moderna appear to be two of the best. The Russian one, I think, is doing pretty well also.
I mean, I think once the U.S. gets through and gets the people vaccinated here that are willing to get vaccinated, I think we'll turn and that production is going to start going overseas, but it's going to be a while for those others. My brother lives in Paraguay, and he said they don't have any real timeline to get vaccines to people. He said something to the effect that, like, the people over 80 are getting it. The other people are not. He's plotting different ways of, like, flying into the U.S. to get a shot. So we'll see how that works out. But he's been hiding out in Paraguay, and now there are certain benefits to American medicine, as being one of them. One thing Carl and I have been saying for a long time is that be careful of claims that it's the shutdowns or government policy that has been slowing down the economy. And here's a great example where the TSA checkpoint, even though you can really travel pretty freely, is only travel through those checkpoints is only at about 60% of what it was in 2019. And so it's still down about 40% from that 2019 level. And it's been coming up. You can see it. And the way this is, these numbers along the bottom are just 1 through 100 days, from starting with January 7th being day 1, April 16th being the latest. So there are about 100 observations in there, and you can see it's been climbing from about 40 to 60, so it's progressing, but still, not what it was 2 years ago. And that's just gets to this idea that it's the virus that is causing people not to travel or not to go to restaurants or not to go to movie theaters or go out. It isn't government restriction, because government is really not restricting your ability to travel very much in the United States. So, Carl, I'll hand off to you.
And yeah, just to reiterate what David was saying, the reason we start with the virus is because we've been saying for the last year, the economy isn't going to recover until we get control of the virus and people get comfortable with the idea of going out and traveling and going to restaurants and going to bars and going to Cubs games and doing a lot of the stuff that we used to do. That's why we're focusing on that. Looking at the labor markets, coronavirus at this point has erased about 5 years of job gains. At its April trough a year ago, it had erased about 10 years of job gains. We were at the level here just over 130 million, which is about where we were in 2010, 2011. Over 22 million jobs were lost in March and April of last year. We're still down 8.4 million jobs from the peak last February. On the other hand, recently in March, we added 916,000 jobs. So that was a good month. Because you see, when we dropped jobs quickly, we recovered jobs pretty quickly. Sorry about that. For a while, and then things flattened out, and more recently it started going up again. Looking at it on a month-by-month basis, we can see we added almost 3 million jobs last May, almost 5 million jobs last June after we passed the CARES Act and started to provide support to people. And then as the CARES Act was dying out and that support, additional jobs, we still were, almost 2 million in July, 1.6 million in August. And then it dropped in September, October. And by the end of the year, we pretty much stopped growing jobs, even as the economy officially was opening up. But we didn't have any supplemental unemployment insurance from the end of July to the end of end of December. In December, we passed a $900 billion package, which provided $300 per week of supplemental unemployment insurance through March, which didn't affect the December numbers because, again, the data date for all of these surveys is the week that contains the 12th of the month. So the impact of that $900 billion wasn't felt until January and then February and March. And then in March, we passed the $1.9 trillion package. But again, it was right at the end of that survey week. And so we didn't really see it in this, in the March survey. We hope to see a big impact in April and May. And so, in terms of where we're at, we're down a little bit more than 5%, which is pretty close to the worst point after the Great Recession. Obviously, this was the deepest decline since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and we're still at a low point. But if we can continue at that 900,000 a month, we should get back to where we were last February by around the end of the year, beginning of next year, which is a relatively quick recovery. The forecast before that $1.9 trillion package was passed and enacted, the economists were forecasting that we would recover by sometime in 2024. Now they're saying sometime in 2022. So a year and a half, 2 years faster on the recovery as a result of the package that just got passed. But, obviously we're improving, but we're still in a big hole. And looking at the employment losses by industry, not shockingly, restaurants, bars, hotels are still the big losers versus February 2020. Even though they're starting to recover, we're still down a lot because, I've gotten my 2 shots and I'll be at my 2 shots plus 2 weeks next Monday, but I'm still, a little hesitant to start, venturing into a lot of indoor restaurants with a bunch of people who haven't been vaccinated and aren't wearing masks. And it'll probably impact me for a while on that front, as well as, some of these other businesses. Unemployment rate, I would say the jobs numbers are more important than the unemployment rate. That said, the U3 unemployment rate is the rate we typically see reported. We see it got up to 10% in the Great Recession at the end of 2009. It got up to almost 15% last year. It's now down at 6%. The U6, so the U3 is people who aren't working, who said that they're looking for work and they've looked for work within the last 4 weeks. The U6 takes all of those people, adds people who aren't working, who've looked for work in the last year, and it also adds all the people that are working part-time who want full-time employment. General number, we've had about 27 million part-time employees for the last, I don't know how many years, most of whom want to work part-time. Students, senior citizens, housewives with childcare responsibilities. But some number of them want to work full-time, and that's what's reflected in the U6 number. We can see here that the unemployment rate varies by ethnic. We have the general unemployment rate, which is the black line, which is the 6%. The Asian rate is slightly below that. The white rate is 0.6 below that. The Latino rate is higher, and the African American rate is substantially higher. Interestingly, the Latino rate jumped the most at the bottom of the recession, but then they've recovered faster than the African Americans. I don't know why. Another thing that we look at is the employment to population ratio for prime working age people to see again how the economy is recovering. And prime working age is 25 to 54. So people below the 25, a lot of them are students and not really looking for work and working. Above 54, you get a fair number of people who start to drop out of the workforce because they're retiring. So this is prime working age. It was up around 80% a year ago, dropped down below 70%. It's now up around 77%, so it's recovered a fair amount, but still has a ways to go before we get back up to that 80.4% or.
Do you look at any of these figures by gender?
I don't have them by gender. They can be gotten by gender. I believe that in terms of the loss of jobs early on, women tended to lose jobs more than men. But in terms of the recovery of jobs now, the women have kind of caught up so that there's not much of a differential in terms of lost jobs between men and women. That's my understanding. Do you know, is that right, David, or do you know anything different?
Don't, but we can put that chart in here for next month. We'll pull that together. There has been quite a story around women taking the bigger hit, and especially working mothers that have had to take care of their kids because they're not in school. So there's definitely a story around that, but I do remember that what Carl said, that started to narrow lately.
Yeah, it seems like the jobs that they more typically are in might be starting to recover, but they're more heavily represented, I think, in the service industries of food and
Correct.
beverage and stuff too.
Yeah. Although most of my friends that are bartenders are male, not female, but what do I know? That's my old volleyball friends. If you look at how many people are shown as unemployed to get to that 6% number, it's under 10 million. But if you look at the number of people who are claiming unemployment benefits, at the time of that survey, it was closer to 20 million. It was 18 million and it's now down in the most recent week, 17 million. So a lot, contrary to the way things were up until a year and a half ago, we used to have a lot more people identified as unemployed than were collecting benefits. You know, again, you don't have to be collecting benefits to be identified as unemployed, and you can be collecting benefits and not identified as unemployed if you're having restricted work hours, so you're working part-time and getting some supplemental benefits, even though you're not. If you work one hour during the survey week, you're not considered unemployed. And so that's why we now have a lot of people who are collecting benefits more than the number of people who are shown as unemployed in that unemployment rate, which is, again, why I say don't put a lot of emphasis on that unemployment rate and brag, oh, it's down to 6%, Biden's doing so great. That really isn't a good metric. The fact that we're adding jobs is a much better metric. Budget deficits and debt, and those are going up. The blue numbers here are the Congressional Budget Office published a forecast back in January of 2017 saying if there are no changes in the policies that are being inherited by the Trump administration, so no change in the Obama era policies, this is what we expect the budget deficits will be in coming years. So 559 billion in fiscal year 2017, 487 billion in fiscal year 2018, etc. Again, remember that fiscal years are October 1st to September 30th. They don't follow calendar years. So fiscal year 2017 is Obama's last budget year. Fiscal year 2021 is Trump's last budget year. His budget years are 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. What we see here is that the actual budget deficit in fiscal year 2017 was a little higher than what was forecast. When we get to 2018, it was about 300 billion higher than what was forecast. 2019, it was 383 billion higher than what was forecast. In 2020, prior to COVID hitting, the forecast was for a budget deficit that was going to be over $1 trillion. Obviously, with COVID and the various packages, the CARES Act, which was a tremendous amount of spending last year, the budget deficit, and all of the what do we call the circuit breakers, the things that kick in automatically, like as people's income goes down, our tax revenue goes down, and our unemployment insurance and our staff benefits and all those things go up, that's what caused the deficit to grow to an all-time high. The prior all-time high was 1.4 trillion. So this is more than twice the prior record. And we're going to be a little higher than that, we expect, in the current fiscal year, which ends September 30th. Again, this fiscal year started last October 1st. So Trump was president for the first roughly 4 months, and Obama's president for the last 8 months of this fiscal year. But as this last note indicates, the forecast for the current year's deficit before the most recent Biden American Rescue Plan Act was for 2.2 trillion. So it was very big. And a large part of the American Rescue Plan Act, like the 400 plus billion of $1,400 checks, was something that Trump supported and wanted to see passed. So again, looking at the budget deficit, it went down under Bush, then went up. So fiscal year 2009 was his last budget year. It trended down. So, watch that. It trended down under Obama, and then came up right at the end. Exploded under Trump. will continue up, but it's expected to go down and actually get under 1.1 trillion for a few years till the end of President Biden's current term. And then it will start to go up again because our population is aging and Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security expenses go up as 10,000 people a day turn 65. Talking about that American Rescue Plan, the $1.9 trillion bill that passed in March. Again, the biggest piece of it was the $1,400 checks, which was, notwithstanding that the bill got 0 Republican votes, that particular portion of it was bipartisan. The unemployment insurance at $300 a week, down from the $400 passed by the House, was bipartisan. They were not in favor of state and local aid. And then you've got a whole bunch of things like tax credits for childcare, aid to families, reopening schools, vaccinations, healthcare, and a whole lot of things that make up the total 1.9 trillion. And again, the $1,400 checks were per person. So for people making up, couples making up to 150 or 160,000, single people making up to, I think, 75,000, and a full 1,400 for dependents. The child tax credit increased. Money for state and local government, the national vaccine program, the unemployment compensation, and the fact that we waive federal taxes on the first $10,000 of unemployment.
So is this how Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson are getting paid? Is that from the National Vaccine Program, or is that something else? And
I think the actual vaccines being purchased may have been funded last year. Okay. I'm not 100% sure. So we may have used some money that was passed this year to obtain more doses, but a big part of it is the use of the National Guard and other resources to get the vaccines from the factories, the plants, whatever we call the place where they make the vaccines, into our arms. So that whole logistical infrastructure has to be paid for, and that's a big part of what's in this 1.9 trillion.
So somebody has to be paying for the renting of a abandoned Sam's Club to do a vaccination center there, for example.
Yeah, my first vaccination site was the old Kmart in Des Plaines on Oakton. So my second one was Stroger Cook County Hospital. So that wasn't a new infrastructure facility. But I know they're still doing vaccines out at the old Kmart in Des Plaines. So there's lots of things in what got passed. One of the more interesting things that didn't necessarily cost a lot of money was healthcare. ACA subsidies got extended. So that prior there was a benefit cliff. If you made more than 400% of the poverty level, people went from getting a decent subsidy to having to pay the full sticker price of insurance. And that was really problematic for older people who have really expensive insurance, like me. And so now they've taken out that cap, and so no one is going to be paying more than 8.5% of their income for insurance, and the premium subsidy gradually phases out. Another thing that comes in this year, from April 1st to September, if you lose your job this year and go on Cobra, the government's going to pick up the Cobra Premium. So Cobra used to be a really expensive option for people who were unemployed temporarily, but this is going to give them, what does that work out to, 6 months of coverage at no cost, no premium cost. In addition, it incentivizes states to expand Medicaid, and And open enrollment for the ACA was opened back up in February and is now extended through, I think, August 15th. So if you don't have insurance, there's probably a pretty good option for you between either expanded Medicaid or policies that are available through the exchanges where you can get significant benefit premiums, or Cobra, if that's an option for you. What's coming up? Typically, presidents are supposed to propose their budget on February 1st. In a transition year where the president takes office January 20th, especially in a transition year where the outgoing president was less than forthcoming with the transition information to allow the incoming president to understand what was going on, that got delayed. And what we've seen is that President Biden has come out with his version of next year's budget this month. And we'll go into a little bit of what's in that. We're not going to go into it in a great deal here. The foreclosure and eviction moratoriums now expire on June 30th, as well as certain portions of the PPP program to pay for workers in companies that are not using those workers. The debt ceiling gets reinstated in July 31st. Hopefully, we can make that a non-event this year and don't have a repeat of, was it 2011, where Boehner and the Republicans threatened to default the U.S. If we wouldn't agree to a bunch of stuff they wanted in the budget deals. Then September 6th, enhanced unemployment benefits of $300 a week, and the COVID-related unemployment programs expire. Hopefully, we will have a whole bunch more people back to work by September 6th. But to the extent that there are people who aren't yet back to work, we may need to go ahead and provide some assistance beyond September 6th for those people who can't yet get back to work. September 30th is the end of the fiscal year. So again, fiscal year 2022 appropriations or continuing resolution has to be enacted to avoid a government shutdown. And there's various things that expire around that. And then more things that expire at the end of the calendar year. So in addition to all of that, as David will talk about later, Biden has his ideas for an infrastructure program and jobs program that he wants to push through this year as well. If we look at the Biden's, quote, skinny budget proposal that came out this month, the spending goes up a little bit in defense, moderate amount in non-defense spending, not huge. This budget does not include the infrastructure plan. And this probably isn't going to look anything like the budget that Congress ends up passing ultimately. So I'm not going to go great into detail. What we see is that it's about $118 billion higher than the current fiscal year. The biggest increase is being in education and health and human services, and then defense, and then VA. And those aren't necessarily things that are surprises to anybody coming out of the Biden administration. And the extent of that, if we add about $100 billion, a little over $100 billion in spending, we're going to increase the budget deficit and debt by about, that the budget looks like it's going to be about $100 billion higher in future years as a result of what's being proposed. But again, I don't put a lot of weight on this because they're going to try and do a lot of different things between now and September 30th. That kind of makes this moot. Any questions on budget deficits, debt? Have I put you to sleep? Hopefully not. And then I'm going to let David, I guess, go over economic statistics. All right, so economic statistics, what are we going to see this year?
Yes, so we got about 10 minutes till break time, so I think this section is fairly short, so it won't be too bad. All right, so you guys have seen the forecast. We shared it last time from the Fed. It hasn't really changed. Definitely, they are very bullish on what's going to happen in the remainder of 2021, thinking that we'll end the year with 6.5% growth. So that's good in the next couple of years, still better than the long run. So that's very, and with the unemployment rate, they're expecting it to drop quite a bit. I think a lot of people are watching the inflation numbers right now. There's a question of, just how big a deficit can the United States run before we get inflation, and we are to some extent testing that hypothesis now, and we'll see. We're going to talk about inflation in a minute. It's still pretty tame. So, and the interest rate, they're not expecting the Federal Reserve to move interest rates for a long time. They said that, and I'll go through this, they have something that's called the Federal Reserve balance sheet, and it has to do with how much bonds that the Fed is buying, and they've been buying an enormous amount. That's a way of stimulating the economy and keeping interest rates low. They can slow that program down or reverse it and actually shrink their balance sheet, meaning they would be a net seller of those bonds as opposed to a net buyer. And they can do a lot of that before they ever get to raising interest rates. So I recall there was something recently where a person said we could be slowing, one of the Fed people said we could be slowing our purchases of assets, our buys of these bonds for a very long time before we start the raising of interest rates. So I'm not expecting interest rates to go up. I think, and you can see here, they're not thinking they'll even go up in 2023. It could be 2024 or later before they would raise interest rates, and I definitely think that's likely. This is a lot of text on this page, but you have it as a reference. But this is a Federal Reserve speech excerpt from a couple weeks ago from Vice Chair Clarida. I may be pronouncing that wrong. Is it Clarida? Clarida? I apologize. I should have checked. But usually I get the speeches from the boss, and then we get the vice chair this time. But he's very bullish. The first few paragraphs are all talking about how the GDP is going to be great, the unemployment rate's falling, the inflation is expected to be moderate. They don't see it being too bad. The thing that's changed in the last couple of years about what the Fed is saying is, in the past it was, we may act preemptively to prevent inflation from even starting to tick up. And that's kind of what you saw in 2019, where the Federal Reserve was raising interest rates and Donald Trump was going crazy saying, why are you raising interest rates? Now, of course, he said the exact opposite under Obama, but I digress. But no president likes to see the interest rates go up because it slows the economy. They all want the interest rates to be as low as they can get away with. But what they're saying now is, instead of saying we'll act preemptively, they're saying we will only be reactive, meaning inflation's got to be higher than 2% for a while before we will react, because they think that if that inflation does tick up temporarily, it will fall. So they don't need to raise interest rates preemptively to head it off. They don't need to raise interest rates unless they see it for a sustainable long period of time. That is a huge change in Fed strategy. And it reflects the fact that for a long, long time, we have not had inflation. And even when the economy was booming, like in 2019, and with a 3.5% unemployment rate, which is very low from historical standards, like tied with like a 50-year low, we still didn't have inflation. So the Fed is kind of learning a lesson that they didn't learn in 2019, and they hadn't learned really before that. They have changed their strategy. So you give them a lot of credit for really changing a lot of their history and being a lot more nimble than you would normally think a group of financial wizards would be. They are saying we're going to endure inflation for a while before we will worry about trying to knock it down with raising interest rates. That's the Dave way of saying the second and third to last bullets on here. The last one also is just we're not going to touch the interest rate until the inflation's been there for a long time. So I guess the last three bullets are kind of my spiel, but it's really a big deal that they've done that, and that's one of the reasons why I think the stock market has done so well, because they know that the Fed is not hurrying to raise interest rates. Because if you remember, interest rates and asset prices move in opposite directions. When you raise interest rates, housing prices fall. When you raise interest rates, stocks tend to fall. They go in opposite directions, kind of almost by definition. So it's a new day at the Fed, and that makes an enormous difference in terms of the economy. It's great news just to see that the Fed is so supportive of what's going on. This is a picture of what's called the Fed balance sheet, and this graph goes from 2004 to today. I think this is a weekly graph for me. Yeah, I think it's weekly. It's even daily. But what this is way back, if you go back before the Great Recession, which is that gray bar here, can you guys see the mouse if I show it on the screen? Is it visible like that? Hey, Carl, tell me, is that mouse visible?
I see it.
There's a mouse in there. Okay, there it is. This is the Great Recession back here. And you can see that the Federal Reserve mainly had about a little bit less than $1 trillion. That's millions of US dollars. So the 1 million on there means $1 trillion. The Fed had a little bit less than $1 trillion and was all in the blue asset. If you look at the top, it says U.S. Treasury securities. So the Fed owned a bunch of Treasury bonds, notes, bills, et cetera. Then the Great Recession hit, and the Fed said, holy cow, nobody is buying mortgage bonds. The housing market is locked up. Nobody's buying this stuff. Fannie and Freddie aren't enough incentive for people to be originating these securities. We've got to become the buyer. And so that's the green. They've been buying mortgage-backed securities in enormous amounts for a long time. And that's one of the ways that they affect longer-term interest rates, that what's called the Federal Reserve funds rate, this interest rate down here at the bottom of the page, that's what you hear about in the news that they change. But when they run their balance sheet, the way they buy bonds is a trick that they use to manipulate longer-term interest rates. So they're buying a lot of these mortgage-backed securities. And repo is a rather complicated thing that I don't want to get into today. We covered it other days, but when the repo market gets into trouble, the Fed will buy more of it. And it's gotten into trouble from time to time, and they bought more. Now, over here at the end, in the 2020 timeframe, that's just this latest mess we've had with coronavirus, where the Fed has also been adding to its balance sheet enormously. The Fed can, what they call unwinding, they can unwind the balance sheet, meaning they can start to sell a lot of this or grow it more slowly. Both have impact on the markets. If the Fed says we're going to slow our buys of bonds, or they say we're going to actually reverse it and start selling bonds, that's going to have a very significant impact. That's going to slow the economy because interest rates will start to go up. If you think of so it's one of those where the Fed is our friend right now, and the stock market is loving that. Interest rates are low because of it, but when they start to switch that, there's going to be an inflection point where the stock market is going to take a hit, and the interest rates are going to start rising, and the economy is going to slow, and the Fed is saying we don't want to do that for a while. But this is a little bit, they can be a little more, I would say this instrument is a little more precise than interest rates. The interest rate is more like a saw, and the bond buying program is more like a scalpel. They can be a little more precise with we're going to slow our bond buying program down slightly over the next year. They can say stuff like that and not freak people out too much. If they say, though, we're going to raise interest rates, or they suddenly raise interest rates, that sends a shockwave to people. So they're going to be playing with this balance sheet before they do it. And all it is like a balance sheet, like with any company. The Fed is buying and selling bonds, and so the more, and this is the assets number, the more they have on their balance sheet, that just means they've bought more bonds that are sitting in their proverbial electronic vault. Inflation, the big story with inflation has really been gas prices, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. If you ignore that, you get the red line, basically. And you can see the red line is pretty smooth for the last, since March of 2020, pretty much in this range of 1.5%. And it doesn't, even if you go further back, it doesn't go much above 2 for a while. And the blue line, though, is more volatile. It's got food and energy in there. And because gas prices have gone up quite a bit versus last year, not so much versus 2 years ago, but a lot since last year, you're seeing this inflation tick up. And it's so the blue line is making people a little nervous, but the red line is not. And let's go into that. I'll give you a little more detail in a second on the gas prices. But the boxed in column there ties to the prior page. So the all items inflation is 2.6%, 12 months, meaning prices are 2.6% higher than they were a year ago. And then the all items less food and energy is that red underline, the 1.6% higher than a year ago. But where the action is right here in energy. And as the economy is turning around, that's creating demand for oil and gas and other kinds of energy. And so you see these prices go up. But also I'm going to show you that the gas prices, they were very low last year. And then apparel, good time to buy shirts. And medical services are always inflating, and it's not a crazy high number for them. I mean, medical services and other medical inflation used to be like 4 or 5%, and it's been coming back down into that 3 to 4 range. So this is not an unusual reading for medical services. There's been a lot of anecdotal stuff about food, but overall food is not crazy inflated either. It's just 3.5%. This is what's going on with gas prices and kind of what's driving this blue line here. If you look at the right-hand graph for a minute, that's gas prices about the same point in 2019, 20, and 21. So the 285 gas price, it's almost the same price as 2 years ago, but it's a 54% increase versus 2020. And that's kind of where this inflation, gas prices, and energy is showing up, is why it's kind of distorting this number, is because if you look at the graph on the left, you had this very deep trough, short-lived, in early 2020 or middle of 2020. And that was coronavirus most likely, but now we're back to a more normal or a high end of normal read. We had the same prices a couple of years ago. Here you see the peaks, from middle of 2018 to the middle of 2019, we were, with except for that loop here, pretty much at the level we are now. So that's sort of the story, is gas prices, energy prices jumping. Some of it is because last year was just an unusual year ago, was just very low. So I would not, the Fed is not worked up about this, nor should you guys be. You'll hear I see a lot of stuff on Twitter. There's a lot of conservatives that want to use inflation rates going up as an excuse to say we need to cut back on Biden's programs. We can't run the deficits because we're getting inflation. The economy's overheating, blah, blah, blah. I think you can disregard that.
Yeah, I would say that the focus should be, if you go back to that graph you were just on, the red line of core inflation without the more volatile food and energy. Because in April and for the next few months after that, the blue line is going to be going way, way up. Because in the March, we were looking at a 22% increase in gas prices. And for April, we think we're going to be looking at like a 42%, 46%. 54% increase in gas prices, just for a few months.
Good point.
And so the headline inflation number is going to be really, really high. The core inflation number, that currently 1.6%, is a much more meaningful number. And again, the core inflation number is the number the Fed wants to get actually up long term at around 2%. So it's still low versus where the Fed wants it.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great. In terms of inflation expectations, there's a way of comparing different bond prices, the 10-year bond, then a 10-year bond that is inflation protected. You can compare them to see kind of what's the market expecting for 10 years out, and it's only 2.3% over the next decade. So the market's assuming the Fed will find a way of getting that inflation number up, but still 2.3 is not a crazy level. It's not 10%, it's not 5%, it's not hyperinflation. It's something that people are getting worked up over on the right. This is just pretty routine, but it has been coming up. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, that's the difference in the two. It's high compared to where it's been in the last 5 years, but it's not crazy high compared to, again, middle of 2018, 19, or even the middle to early 2017. It's pretty similar. All right. And then the last one is in this section is the mortgage rates. Mortgage rates had fallen quite a bit. Now they're starting to climb. You're seeing, just anecdotally, I live in Lincolnshire. You're seeing a sort of a frenzy of home buying right now. Homes are selling at a good price, at almost at list price, and they're selling fast. Like a house gets listed, it's gone in 2 weeks. Then that's in the houses in the price range, anywhere between 400,000 and 600,000 in Lincolnshire, because people are trying to get out of the cities. The higher priced houses in the million range are not going any faster. It's just the homes that professionals can buy, they're getting out of the cities and they're coming into the burbs. And Lincolnshire has a really good school district, so that helps. But these houses are jumping in prices, and that's surprising considering mortgage rates have been going up, because usually it goes the other way. But generally, as these mortgage rates come up, some of that will probably slow up over time. But right now it's being driven by people trying to get out of the cities and get into the school districts before next summer. So yeah, if you're trying to sell your house in that middle range or middle to high range in Lincolnshire, you're in a good position. All right, well, let's take a break, and then we'll get into the sector balances in the Biden plan. So